Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of the week. And in today's show, we are looking at the aftermath of Operation Infatuate, how the British and the Dutch dealt with the floods, the damage, and the complicated process of restoring the infrastructure. A lot of today's info comes from my guest's fairly new book on the Terrapin amphibious vehicle. There's my copy there, but not just that. We're going to be talking about bits of mulberries and ducks, I think, will come into the conversation as well, wall engineers. But I'll bring in my guest now. Good evening, Phil. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. So this is a really interesting story, which we'll get into because it brings together science, technology, but there's also the human drama of dealing with all these washed out areas, the floods there. And you're sort of self-confessed tank vehicles, equipment, mechanics guy, but this is a really more of a human interest story. So how was it a different type of research project for you when you put this one together?
It was. I mean, researching the Terrapin is actually quite a lot different from researching a tank. And when I got to the story of Walcheren, in order to understand why the vehicles were there, I actually had to understand the pacing of the story of how Walcheren was recovered from the floods.
Yeah.
And again, as an aside, it's quite an interesting story because there's a lot of it that's unknown. And there is a technical side and a human side as well. Yeah, there's a sense of, and also there's parts of the 21st Army Group that are quite recondite, that are unknown to most people because they're parts of 21st Army Group that are in the background and aren't normally known about. And we'll see those as we go forwards.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing. We tend to focus on the point of the spear, what was happening at the sharp end, the infantry, the tank units. But there's this massive, great tale that is 21st Army Group. The whole REME and workshops and logistics that's behind it. So we'll get into that later on. So my guest has come on with his PowerPoint presentation. So I hand over to him to take us through this. And folks, fire away with questions. But there's a lot of slides, a lot of information coming. So I think a lot of your questions will be answered as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to my guest. So over to you, sir.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off. I'm just going to give a little bit of background, which I think has probably already been covered this week. But again, what happens is, as a result of Operation Infatuate, which is the amphibious assault on Walcheren Island, on two coasts, mainly at places called one place called Flushing or Vlisselbel, and the other at Veskapel. And what happens is the 1st Canadian Army has requested the flooding prior to the attack. This is ideally so they can get through the sea defences and have an amphibious landing straight through the sea defences. And there are 4 sites on the island that are targeted by Bomber Command to induce flooding. There's Veskapel, Vlissingen on the south coast, Fort Emmekens on to the southeast, and Veer on the northeast coast. So if I just go through to so these are the 4 places that have been hit. Now, and they're all hit on different days. Basically, they as parts of the flooding are photographed and identified, they realise they're going to have to hit more places to actually increase the area of flooding. So that's why there's 4 places hit. So if I go to the next slide, so that happens in early October, and Infatuate itself commences on the 1st of November and is successfully completed on the 8th. Mainly, it's from what I've read, it seems to have assisted in the assault by actually limiting the enemy movements on the island. For example, resupplying the guns at Veskapel with ammunition. They do a lot of damage to civilian property on the island, on the coast, so especially at Veskapel. And they also induce, I think there's well over 100 civilian casualties. Now, the result of these breaches are the tides inundate the island twice a day, and when they ebb, they leach the soil. And on the island itself, the 2 main cities, parts of the 2 main cities, not the entirety of those 2 main cities, but parts of the main cities are the only major population centres remaining above the waterline. Now, when the Allies move in, they're going to have to accommodate their forces somewhere, and it's these 2 cities that are chosen. And so them and the residual population, there's actually a real premium on accommodation on the island for the civilians who remain and for the Allied soldiers who come in. Now, the population is reluctant to be evacuated. Before the operation Walcheren, it's quite the inhabitants of Walcheren are quite insular, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's just that Walcheren is the only world they know, right?
Yeah.
They're a largely agricultural population. They don't travel much, you know, and they've got livestock there, right? They have livestock, so they don't really want to abandon their farms and leave. Okay. So what happens is basically a lot of them, when the flooding happens, and the flooding isn't immediate. It's not like it's 1 or 2 days and the floods just coat the island. It takes a few weeks for the flood water to really cover the island. So there is plenty of time to evacuate, and there is an evacuation program. Lots of people are taken away, but some of them drift back. Some of them refuse to be evacuated. And what they tend to do is they tend to live either in the garrets of their houses, or some of them live in German bunkers. Often they keep their livestock with them in the bunkers or in the garrets. And it's a pretty unpleasant life because, for example, there's no electricity available. Heating's a problem. Motorized transport is impossible in the flood water. And there's things, but the one thing that keeps them going actually is for food. Is the food they get is the German bunkers, fortunately, are full of food, so they're generally eating German rations, but it's a fairly hard existence for them.
Yeah.
Immediately after the Operation Infatuate, the major unit that comes onto Walcheren, and there's a neighbouring island of South Beveland, and that's the 76th Anti-Aircraft Brigade, who some people might know. They're one of the assault anti-aircraft brigades in Operation Overlord, right? And what they're doing is they're there to monitor and defend the north side of the Scheldt. On the south side of the Scheldt, I think it's the 105th Anti-Aircraft Brigade, and Antwerp, it's the 5th Royal Marine Anti-Aircraft Brigade. Because once the Scheldt has been sort of cleared, it's still not safe because you've got German mine-laying aircraft coming in, you've got midget submarines and so forth. There's occasional nuisance raids, and it's a way, and it's a way into attacking Antwerp as well as being sort of target in itself. So they've got anti-aircraft brigades there operating as anti-aircraft and coastal defence. Now these bring with them hutted accommodation for their own personnel, which they put on some of the uplying land, and they also bring amphibian transport. Though at the beginning it's mainly terrapins with a handful of ducks. It's about 19 terrapins, and I think there's 3 ducks there. Now there's no reconstruction of the dikes possible during active hostilities, right? Because you're potentially under German fire. Then there's nearby island called Overflack, which is still occupied by the Germans, and also a lot of the Dutch experts are still in German occupied territory, and a lot of the equipment they need, like especially dredgers. A lot of the Dutch dredger fleet has actually been taken by the Germans, and it's been transported all over Europe to be used by the Germans themselves. Okay. Now this is a picture. It's a photograph of the breach at Walcheren. At Westkapelle. Now this is just after the bombing, right? So what you have to imagine is after several months, that breach is going to open up and be much wider. Okay, so and that just shows you how the water's coming in through to, and that's actually Westkapelle town in the bottom right hand corner, and as you see this big mass of water coming in. And this is just a couple of pictures of what life is like on Walcheren. On the bottom right, you can see how they've actually put a boardwalk to allow access to the garrets of the houses. Okay, so and that's a boardwalk and a mooring and a jetty for mooring. On the top, one of the things that you can use for transport in a flood is horses and carts. So that's actually the main way that the actual the locals move themselves about. Now, because they can't immediately work on repairing the breaches because the war's still ongoing, over the winter, you know, the weather's quite harsh in Walcheren, and the tides expand the breaches. And what they do is they scour deep channels. So below the water, there's erosion happening, and there's channels being eroded under the water. Now, the first person to look at this is a guy called the first Dutch engineer to look at the problem of sort of scoping out the problem of repairing the breaches. Is a guy called Peter Phillip Janssen, and he writes a report on the 26th of February 1945, and he says taking the most serious view and assuming the present conditions were allowed to continue throughout this year, it is considered that the effect of a further winter may have disastrous effects. The remaining farms and houses would be washed away. Areas now dry would become flooded, owing to the continued widening and deepening of the erosion and tides. It is possible to visualise the complete loss of the island, representing some 45,000 acres of valuable cultivated land. So what he's suggesting is the whole thing might go if they don't actually attack the problem of repairing the dikes as urgently as possible. Now he proposes a draft outline plan of how to repair the sea dikes, and he submits it to the SHAFE HQ in Brussels and the British government. And what it's mainly, the main part of the plan is he's actually written down a big list of equipment that's needed, both the land and at sea. And you've got their dredgers, motor launchers, barges, excavators, bulldozers, cranes, but also things like rope, stone, matting, and it's just a huge list. It's six pages of material which he actually composes. Now, looking at this is a map of the flooding. Okay. Now, what you need to understand about this is if you can see the white areas are the areas that have been flooded on the island, right? And what you can see is that there's actually two areas of flooding, right? Because that line that goes from Flushing in the south through Middelburg, which is the main city, up to Veer in the northeast corner, is actually a canal, right? And that's an elevated canal, right? It's an elevated canal, an elevated banked canal, okay, which provides a barrier, right, that prevents the flood water that's coming from Fort Ramekins in the southeast joining the flood water from the other three breaches. Right. So you've basically got three. You got two areas of flooding. One big, one substantial, and one quite small. The other thing that's worth looking at on that map is coming from the causeway from South Beverland. There's a railway that goes from the far east, goes past Middelburg and into Flushing, and that railway does have some utility in repairing the breaches, but we'll come to that. And again, what I've done here, this is my sort of crappy effect, but this blue line, what it is, it represents what would be a scoured channel. So you can imagine under the water, there's a scoured channel. Yep. Underneath the water. In reality, it wouldn't be that nice and neat. Often there's two or three scoured channels, all interconnecting and then branching apart under the water. So underwater, there's quite complex things going on the seabed that you can't see. Okay. Yep. That complicates things. Now, after the German surrender in May 45, actually repairing these dikes becomes possible. And the general principle adopted is for the British to supply most of the equipment and for the Dutch to sort of basically oversee the repair work. Yep. And to undertake it themselves. So what I've said there is the British contribute the equipment on the principle of, we broke it, we fix it. Well, the Dutch are the experts in dike building and dike repair, so why not let them do it? And I say the British also have some other motivations. They don't want to overstay their welcome, which they're doing, right? If there's some quite interesting documents from the burgomaster in Antwerp saying, why, when are you buggers going to go, basically? They've got lots of men who don't want to be there. Lots of the British troops, when they want to be going home, they want to be demobbed. And also, of course, Britain doesn't finish the war in a particularly wealthy situation, and all this is cost. So there's quite strong motivations for the British to sort of like give as much responsibility to the Dutch, and then they can go.
And this isn't the only thing the Allies are doing. I mean, even from when the war was still running, you know, we saw it in Masters of the Air, the dropping of food parcels to the Dutch. You know, the British and the Allies are still trying to help not just this area of the Netherlands, but also other parts of occupied Europe. And there's only so much food to go around. We don't talk enough about how short the world was in 45 and 46 of just kind of the basic ingredients.
Yeah, and there's also plenty of work to going on in the Netherlands elsewhere, because of course on the southern side of the Scheldt, of course that's the area around the Breskens pocket, and that's the area that the Germans have flooded. Yeah, right. The Germans flooded that to keep the Canadians at bay, and there's also flooding elsewhere in German areas north of Walcheren. But also, like, the British are assisting in rebuilding Arnhem Bridge. That's one thing the Royal Engineers are working on. So there's plenty of repair work that's going on, and the British are assisting with. What's going on? Now, what I've shown here is just the basics of dike repair. So what you do is basically you start to build. On the left, you can see there's like a clay wall that you build. You build it up and you put sand in on the landward side of the clay, and you build up. Now the thing with this is that the sand is basically what happens is when you build these sand backed dikes. The sand, you usually use two dredgers. Okay, now there's one dredger out to sea in a sheltered area, because it has to stay in one place for a long time and it can't be affected by the current. That dredger is sucking sand up from the sea bottom, right? Then it's and that's called that dredger is called a sucker, right? And that dredger puts the sand into a barge, right, alongside. Then that's towed to another dredger that's near the sand, that's just off the shore of the dike. That's called a blower, and that dredge has a pipe going from it, and that sand is pumped in a water mixture. So there's a mixture of about 75 to 80% water, 20-25% sand, and that's pumped onto the area behind the clay. Well, it's the clay bund, really, the clay wall. And then as you do that, on the outside of the clay, you put basically a brushwood mattress, and then you line it with stone. Okay, that's the basic method of dike construction. Now, and then what you do is you see, then they've started to build a sort of on the lower diagram, you can see there's a thing called HWL and LWL, and that's high water line and low water line. So the first story of the dike matches up to the high water line, and you build an extra layer, and that's for storm protection. Right. So when you get high waves from storms, you need that extra height of the dike to just protect against storms. And also there's the slope. The slope is 1 to 4 or 1 in 10. That's just wave action. It's just to mollify the force of the sea as it hits the end of the dike. Now, what those diagrams didn't show you is that those dikes are built on these mattresses, these sort of like these brushwood mattresses. They're mainly made from willow. All right. Now, this is a very specialist job, because the people who make these, there's only one group of people who know how to make these, and these are people from a place called the Biesbosch, which is a part of the Netherlands just to the southeast of Dordrecht, which is just to the southeast of Rotterdam. So there's about 400 workers they brought in from the Biesbosch to Walcheren to make these brushwood mattresses. And what they've done happens is that they're made just on the shore, right? And when the tides are correct, and we'll talk about tides later, these are drifted out to sea with the people on them, right? And when they're in the right place, they're loaded with stone by hand and sunk slowly into the water, right? Then that also and then some barges might come along and tip stones on them to keep them down. And then from what the diagrams we've seen earlier, then the dikes are built on top of these.
Right.
So these things are actually a crucial aspect of the job. Okay. And this is just a picture here. This is a blower dredger, right? So you can see it's quite low in the water, and you see those pipes on those gantries.
Yeah.
That's where the sand is blown onto where the dike is being built. Okay. So that's a blower dredger. Sorry, that's a blower dredger. And this is a picture taken at Fort Ramekins, and this you can see the pipe, and what's spraying out that pipe is actually a sand water mixture. Right. Now, what happens is when you blow that sand water mixture into the gap, about 90% of the sand is actually removed via erosion before it stays. So it's a very intensive job to actually keep this thing going and keep the sand pumped on, and it slowly builds. The bits that doesn't get eroded builds up, and you actually build your dike from that. Now, when it comes to the overseeing of this project, there's two groups. There's the British and the Dutch, basically. And from the British side, it begins as 21st Army Group, but I think August, September, it starts to become British Army on the Rhine, or of the Rhine, British Army of the Rhine. And the arms of 21st Army Group involved are ones that are generally quite unfamiliar to most people. The first organisation that's involved is what's called the Lines of Communication, and that's oversees all sort of that oversees the supply lines from the rear marshalling area, which originally was in Normandy, up to the frontal areas. And by this time, what happens is, as the war progresses, the lines of communication areas are divided into sub areas, right? And in Zealand, where Walcheren is, and the whole Scheldt estuary comes under 5 base sub area, right? But the surrounding sub areas, like 7 base sub area, 11 base sub area, they're also involved in this. But it's 5 base sub area is the main part of the lines of communication that works on this, right? Another group that's involved is a part of 21st Army Group called Civil Affairs, right? And that's the civilian liaison arm of 21st Army Group. And they've got, if you go into the National Archives, their war diaries are huge. I mean, these were doing lots and lots of very detailed work, which is probably very few people know about. Another group is Supplies and Transport, right? And Supplies and Transport is basically who looks the higher organisation of the Royal Army Service Corps, okay? And they oversee things like, the Terrapins and the dykes and all the supply work that those do. And also directly overseeing the work that we're going to be looking at is the Royal Engineers. And there's two commanders there's 2 Royal Engineers organisations that are important in this story. That's the Netherlands, the Commander Royal Engineers Netherlands, and the Commander Royal Engineers of the line of communications, lines of communication. And Shafe HQ in the Netherlands also, I think they're based in The Hague. They also take an interest in this. Now, the 2 names I've underlined, Brigadier Ernest Montgomery and Brigadier Eric Esberg Reed, are the 2 people who directly oversee the British part of the repair of the breaches. Okay. Now, on the Dutch authorities involved, the main one is the Rijkswaterstaat, which translates loosely as the Director General for Public Works and Water Management. And they're the people who oversee all the canals and waterways in the Netherlands. They're still going, huge organisation, sort of very technically adept. Then from the Rijkswaterstaat, they spawn their own sub-organisation, especially for the Walcheren job. That's called the Dienst Droogmarking Walcheren. I apologise for any Dutch viewers for that. If my pronunciation isn't too close, but so that's that's under the person we previously met, Peter Phillip Jansen. There's the Polder Walcheren, which is just a local. It's a local organisation for looking after dikes and waterways on Walcheren, But what they end up doing in this case is they look after all the ancillary work projects like road mending, hole filling, etc.
Mm.
And then you've got the Institute of Technology in Delft, which is colloquially known as Delft University, and they are involved in water tank testing. Basically, everything they do, every strategy that's used to repair the dikes, because you'll see they get quite complex, is generally tested in their water tanks first. And these are big water tanks. These are tanks that you've got to have you walk over on an overhead gantry. You know, they're just these big water tanks. And they generally work at about, I think they generally work about at 1/12 scale on their models. So they're still pretty big models. So the first thing they do, I mean, one of the first things they look at is basically you've got 4 gaps. Now, one of them is only floods a small area, but the other 3, all they have to work out is what happens if you close one gap first. What happens at the other 2, right? Because what you've got to remember is no matter how big the gap is, it's the same amount of water coming on and off the island. Okay. So what they find is if you close one gap, the water traveling through the other 2 gaps speeds up. Right? So, and this is one of the big, we'll come to this as we go on, but trying to manage the currents traveling through the breaches is very important, because obviously the faster these currents are, the harder the gap where they are, it closes. Okay. So and they also do things like break on these water tanks. They also test things like breakwaters, and also, you know, how you're going to close a particular gap, the order of how you're going to block it, and all this sort of thing. They're trying to work this out beforehand. And the last people on the Dutch side is the Netherlands Military Authority, and what they really do. They're the backside kickers. So if the rights will start think the British aren't supplying the right, you know, the equipment fast enough, or they don't think the British are helping them enough, they talk to this guy, Commander Cornelius Slot, and he's the guy who kicks the British up the backside to actually get their act together, which he does fairly regularly. Now, what their aim is that they sort of set a deadline for the work to be completed before the 1st of November. That's when the winter storm period commences. Right. That's when actually doing these repairs becomes more and more difficult. Okay. Now, the priorities as they see them are to complete Westkapelle first, then Flushing, then Veer, then Fort Rammekens. Now, Fort Rammekens is obviously last because it only floods a limited local area, right? Now, and the priorities for the first 3 are basically how bad the conditions are in that local area. Right. Westkapelle is the one that's directly facing the North Sea, so that's the one that's going to be most affected by the stormy weather when it comes. Then Flushing is in the southwest, and that's reasonably exposed to the North Sea. And Veer is in the northeast. Veer is quite sheltered, so. Right. That is going to be the 3rd, but this isn't. But this, although this is the ideal priority, it won't be reflected in the priority of the work, because although Westkapelle is the most important, it's also one of the most difficult. Okay, right. So what they tend to do is you'll see they go to Flushing first, because Flushing is just the easiest to do. Right. So again, this is just a reminder. I'll just put this here, just a reminder of where they are. You've got Westkapelle on the northwest there, Flushing onto the south, Rammekens to the southeast, and Veer to the northeast. And you can see both Rammekens and Veer are reasonably sheltered. Westkapelle is very exposed. Flushing is somewhat exposed. Okay. Now, the serious work commences at the beginning of June 1945. The specialist workers, for example, the ones from the Biesbosch, come in from other areas of the Netherlands. Many of these, because they're as homesick as the people of Walcheren. Yeah. You know? So many of those, and of course, what happened? And of course, the accommodation on the Walcheren is pretty unpleasant. What they do is when the 76th Anti-Aircraft Brigade move away, they provide them they take the hutted accommodation from that brigade and move it up to places like Westkapelle and Veer for the workers. But it's pretty miserable conditions. It's damp, you know. The hutted accommodation isn't great. So a lot of them want to return home at the weekend. So they will go from train at Flushing by that way. And things like the Terrapins and Ducks will transport some of these to the station. The repair work will require a maximum of 3,300 workers, and about a third of these are from Walcheren. They're not always a highly motivated workforce. Generally, the workers from Walcheren are, but from elsewhere they're not so much. A lot of it is because a lot of these workers are fairly malnourished because they haven't been, especially if they've been in the German occupied areas, they've been underfed for quite a long period. Again, the accommodation, the conditions aren't very nice. And there's all sorts. And another thing that there's fair few strikes, and you know some of them are you know they're and a lot of these people actually, a lot of the Dutch people from these areas, they're actually very highly religious, and so working on the Sabbath is something that they don't take kindly to. Now there's German prisoners of war also working there. They're generally doing the demining and clearing the ammunition dumps. Now these German prisoners of war, they're actually field engineers. They're not just ordinary infantry who are sort of sacrificed to you know on dangerous mine clearing work. They're actually German field engineers, so they actually know what they're doing. And again, as I said, the accommodation is provided. A lot of the accommodation for the workers is provided from that was allocated to the 76th Anti-Aircraft Brigade, and also the Terrapins and Ducks for intercommunication from that brigade are retained on the island for you know various. They do like a civilian bus service, and they do transfer workers about, things like that. Here you see a Terrapin. This is the one of the ones. This is from 199 company RASC, who did much of the work of transporting locals and military personnel once the 76th Anti-Aircraft Brigade left the island.
And I'm glad you mentioned the civil affairs earlier, because in this situation, you've got to just keep, in a sense, the hearts and minds of the locals understanding what's going to be happening, because the process of making things better is going to mean that it's going to get worse before it gets better in that sense, in that water's going to be in the wrong place. There's going to be mud, there's going to be mess, there's going to be sand, there's going to be workers going all up and down. So having people there to just, if nothing else, just communicate, look, we're doing this today, it's going to do this, it's going to affect that. It's incredibly important because you know that the Dutch, having been occupied for 5 years by the Germans, they don't want to be seeing an autocratic kind of army coming in just taking control. That's how the Atlantic Wall was built. This obviously has to be built with much more information being shared, so that they feel that they are part of the process and they're not being controlled. I'm glad we don't talk enough about the civil affairs units as a passing comment.
Yeah, I mean, there are some academic papers on civil affairs which I've briefly perused, but yeah, civil affairs and lines of communication and to an extent supplies and transport are areas of 21st Army Group and probably the British Army as a whole that are not widely known, and they probably did a lot of vital work. Certainly, my reading on the Royal Army Service Corps is that I think they are probably the most competent part of the British Army. And I think the Royal Army Service Corps were really good from that. Even in May 1940, the Royal Army Service Corps were absolutely on the ball. So there's a lot of people. Yeah, there's a lot of activity there.
Well, this came up in the sidebar earlier with the Royal Army Service Corps and the Royal Engineers. Is that they have to be good at a whole lot of different things. Whereas, I guess if you're a tank crew, you have to be good at being a tank crew, but and that takes a lot of challenges. But Royal Engineers are, I know they were breaking down particular units, were doing mine clearing, but you've got to be an all-rounder and good at all of those skills. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so by late June, it was becoming clear to the British that the work isn't proceeding quickly enough. Now, the British blame the slowness of the Dutch workers, and the British said, well, it's they are undernourished and all this sort of thing. And the Dutch blame the absence of promised equipment, and especially the dredgers. They haven't got the dredgers they need. And that's because, as I said earlier, the Germans have scattered these dredgers all around Europe, and actually locating them and getting them back is quite difficult. I mean, one dredger they find in Marseille, of all places, they have to bring that back. What happens is, and there's also, they're having trouble. What the Dutch are also doing is they're having trouble closing. The Dutch are okay at bringing the two, because I'm trying to get both my hands in the pit. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Oh, can you do big screen? That's it. Lovely. I'm trying to get my magic explaining hands, but I've got to use this one now. Because what happens is, because when you repair the dike, you're repairing it from both sides. Okay.
Right.
And what happens is, of course, as you bring the two sides closer and closer, and that gap gets narrower and narrower. Okay. The current of water going through it speeds up.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Now the point is that, and generally, the last places that get closed, that last gap is generally where there's a scoured channel, right? Because the scoured channels are where the bulk volume of water is, and the water is flowing fastest. And they actually refer to these channels as rivers, because the torrent is so quick. And what happens is, at a certain point, as you bring these things together, these two ends together, the speed of the water erodes the ends of the dike as quickly as you can build them. Okay. And there's no ready, and of course, if you've got all the time in the world, you can spend time actually, slowly clipping these two together. Because they're running against the clock, they realize that they can't, they need a new way of actually quickly closing these gaps so they can actually bring it together. Okay.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that, and if you go back to the slides, and that's one of the things that they need to bring, that Royal Engineers are for. So what they do is, there's three big meetings happening. There's one at 5 lines of communication sub area at Breda headquarters. Then there's one in The Hague at Scheldt headquarters. And then from those two meetings, they decide to call a third meeting on Walcheren itself. And these all happen on the 26th of June, 1945, right? And so what they do is they say to, they tell the War Office, and it's in the War Office, there's a department called the Department of Transportation, and they get the Department of Transportation to actually pull their finger out, and anything the Dutch need and are lacking, I think they want it they say get these in there by the second week of July. Now, again, the Directorate of Transportation, the War Office, it's another great black hole that nobody knows about. If you go into the National Archives, I think it's in the WO165 series, there's actually 4 huge boxes of papers from the Directorate of Transportation. And these people were building roads, they were building ports, they're building railways all over the world. The British Army was a huge infrastructure builder in the Second World War, right? And I could tell when I opened these boxes, I was the first person to ever look in them, because all the papers are all the papers were so untouched, right? But this is a huge part of what the British Army did in the Second World War, virtually unknown, worth researching. But anyway, they said they decided to furnish any outstanding equipment, and also to provide a special engineer from Britain to go in and help them. Okay, and so enter this man, Major Alan Beckett. And he arrives at Walcheren in early July. Now he was a major figure in the design of the Mulberry harbours. And what Beckett proposes is to use Mulberry components to quickly fill channels in, those gaps, to quickly fill the channels and the gaps, in order to put the dike repair program back on track. Now, what he says is, from the Mulberry harbour works, when they built the Mulberry harbours, what they had to do to protect the harbours was produce breakwaters, and that involved sinking block ships and provide breakwaters. And what they learned from that was the Royal Engineers learned to quickly and accurately sink ships. Okay, and because a lot of these channels that they need to block are of a defined width and defined length, they need to drop components into those channels and seal them almost in one go. Okay, Now, initially, the Dutch aren't particularly convinced by this. So what they do is, so again, whenever Beckett has a proposal to seal a gap, they take it to this Professor Tice at Delft University to put it in the water tank, see how it works, and at least give some confidence in the job before they undertake it. And again, just going through some of the Mulberry components in case people aren't familiar with them. Again, this is the most well known, the Phoenix caisson. Yeah. You can see this is deliberately designed to break water, so it's designed to sink. And you can see the scale of the people. You know, these are huge components, right? Yep. So they want to use some of these on Walcheren. The next component they're going to use, which is probably the most important component, and this is called an intermediate pierhead pontoon, right? Now, on Walcheren they just call them intermediates, and basically on the Mulberry Harbour, you can see in the background, now the intermediate is this big concrete square, right? Yep. In the foreground. And what these did was on the Mulberry Harbours, behind it, you'll see what's called a spud pierhead, right? And that's when ships were unloading in the Mulberries, they would draw alongside the spud pierhead and unload from there. And what the intermediate pierhead pontoon was, it was basically an extension to the spud pierhead. So if a longer ship came in, you could also unload onto the intermediate pierhead. And just projecting off that intermediate is a roadway that connects to the next spud pontoon. So those intermediates, these were and again, these would turn out to be a nice size for plugging gaps on Walcheren. Mm-hmm. The next component they would use this is what was called a whale roadway. And the whale roadway is supported by a series of pontoons, which you can see just on the right here. Yep. There's a guy standing on. These are called beetle pontoons. And like the intermediate pierhead pontoons, these were designed to float. Okay. And Beckett will also use beetles for plugging smaller gaps, right? So these will be brought along, and these will have to be towed from Britain over the North Sea to Walcheren to be used. And another component they would use, and this is actually an American pontoon. This is what's called a Navy lighterage pontoon or an NL pontoon. And basically, they're quite small pontoons, but you can see there's a single one in the foreground. In the background, you can see they've all been connected together, battened together to form. You can form piers and roadways with them. So they're like a building block pontoon. They're quite useful. And what they'd also use improvised ships. And another thing they used was German invasion barges that were reserved for Operation Sea Lion. They brought some of those up to the coast, as we shall see, and so German Sea Lion invasion barges would also be used to plug the gaps. Now, the sinking of these Mulberry components was quite a complex job because there's several critical factors, and the thing about them is you can't really afford an error. I'll explain why. Now, the first thing you need to do is when you're trying to plug a channel, what they had to do was actually find an accurate profile of the channel. Once you're plugging it, because they use polling or echo sounding, so you need to know the shape of the channel and how wide it is and so forth before you actually drop anything in it. Now, when you were dropping a component into the water to block a channel or seal a gap, you want the optimum weather conditions, and what you optimally want is what's called a neap tide, right? Yeah. And there's only two of those. There's 4 tides a month. There's 2 neaps and 2 springs. Okay, and neap tides are when the gravitational pull of the moon is at its least. Okay, and what that means is that the difference between the height difference in height between high tide and low tide is at its minimum. Yeah. Right. And what that means is there's less water coming on and off the island, so the currents are at their slowest. Right. Okay. So you want to drop any components on the neap tides, and you want to do it in a period called slack water. And the slack water is a period between when the tide is going out and when the tide is coming in. Okay, so as the tide comes out, it reaches an optimum speed, and as it starts to slow, and then it will stop, and then the next tide will come back in. Okay, and also, so you're looking for slack water at a neap tide, and also you want to have good conditions, because if you can have a neap tide and slack water, but if a storm's blowing, you still can't drop in those conditions, right? And the other thing you need to look at is method of sinking, because again, with most of these pontoons, like the intermediates and the Beetles and the NL pontoons, they're designed to float. Okay, and what you need to do is you need to now there's different methods used because the Phoenixes, they're designed to sink, and they use so they have their own method, which is valves. You open a valve at the bottom of the Phoenix and it drops down. Trouble with that is it's quite slow, right? So although a Phoenix is big and heavy, it doesn't actually sink particularly quickly. Now they're only dropping about between 1 and 3 meters when they're dropping, but they have to be accurate to the foot when they drop. Okay, so what you want them to drop as quickly as possible. With intermediates, they put explosives in the bottom, and they blow out the bottom in certain particular areas to get it to sink. Okay, and with the Beetles, they use metal poles to just crack the concrete at the bottom to crack out holes to allow it to sink. Now, when you're sinking these, what they do is they preload them to make them heavy, right? So that they drop. So what you do is basically, when you're dropping in slack water, you can choose slack water before an incoming tide, or you can choose slack water before an outgoing tide, an ebb tide. And what they generally do is they choose the slack water before an ebb tide, because in the ebb tide, the water level is actually going down anyway. Okay, right. So when the thing's dropping in the water's dropping as well. Whereas if you drop in a rising tide, you're dropping in the water, but the water's rising. So that counteracts the effect of the whatever pontoon you're using sinking. So they'd be preloaded with clay to make them heavier, and as they're sinking, clay is poured in to actually increase the weight until they sink and hit the bottom. Now, and of course, when you're setting off the explosives or knocking the holes in the bottom, you've got blokes on board, right? And when they set the timers on the explosives, those blokes have got to get off and row for all their lives worth before the charges go off. You've only got 10 to 12 minutes to do that. Okay, so it's all a race against time.
There's a lot of factors to juggle in this. Tides, weather, precision, accuracy, the safety of the engineers, and as you said, there's all these workers. A lot of specialist knowledge of the people who are actually overseeing the timing of this. This is not, in a sense, like some of these engineer units have been throwing up Bailey bridges 2 a day for 2 years. They could do that kind of in their sleep. There's a lot of precision involved in this. A lot of it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and well, the next thing is, of course, see, another thing is once it's hit the bottom, right, then your problems start. Okay, because what happens is once the slack water goes and the tide starts coming in, then you've got, although that ship or pontoons on the bottom, you've got pressure coming in from the current of the tide coming in or going out, right? So what you've then got to do, so what they have to have is they have to have barges of stone and clay alongside. Okay, and what they have to do is, and then you have another type of dredger called a floating grab, and that's basically a flat barge with a crane on it, and the crane has a floating grab. It's like a clamshell bucket, right? And that has to pull up to get these stones off these barges and drop it on top of where you've laid your pontoon on the bottom. Okay, because what you're doing is you're just adding more and more weight and building on it so that the current can't shift it. Okay, because you can drop it on the right place, but if the current starts to get, once the pressure of the current gets on it, it can move it, and it can even sweep it away. So you've got to have all these tugs and barges nearby, right, ready to sweep in, right, and fill it with and cover it with stone. Now the thing is as well, if you're working on an ebb tide, that can be problematic, because if the tide's going out and you're bringing these tugs in, if you don't do this quickly enough, those tugs can ground. Okay, so your tug masters, who are all the tug masters are invariably Dutch, right? They have to know what they're doing. So all the tug masters and the guys running on the barges have to know what they're doing. Okay, so what it is what you have is it's a choreographed operation. Okay, where and the choreography of how this is done is worked out in the water tank at Delft University. Then it's put into action. Okay, so we'll go on from there. Now, the first breach, the first gap they try to close at Flushing, and they try to close this on the 22nd of August 1945, and they try to sink 5. They've got a row of beetles in there already, and they try to sink the last 5 beetles, and they achieve it. Oh no, and they achieve it, but the first time a spring tide comes in, right, which is a fast tide, right, that just sweeps them away, right. So what they do is they conclude that we must bring the two ends a bit close together and use a larger vessel, and they use a German invasion barge, and the gap, and they get that in place. Perfect, brilliant, get it done. So on the 25th of September, there's a storm, and it sweeps part of the dike away, right? And for Alan Beckett of the Royal Engineers, this is rather embarrassing, because the two top Dutch engineers, Jansen and Verhey, actually see this happen. Okay, so he doesn't get off to a good start. But the weather in September has been particularly poor. Okay, so there's a diagram here of the events I've just described. So at the top here, you can see in Nolla is Flushing. The dike is called the Nolla dike, and it's just to the west of Flushing. And you can see they've got 120 metre gap there. They try to put these 5 beetles in, these small pontoons, these small bridge carrying pontoons, and the spring tide just scatters the line of them. So, and you can see, and it actually increases the gap, right? So it's part of the dike is taken away. So in part C here, you can see they actually close the gap altogether. They close the gap closer, and they put that ship is the German invasion barge. Put it in, it works. But on the storm of the 28th, and they start to build up by the 24th of September. But by the 28th of September, the storm just takes that thing out, right? Takes the ship out. So what they do is, but luckily, in the first 3 weeks of October, they get fantastic weather. Okay, and another thing about Walcheren, it's not actually that far north. I mean, Walcheren is on a line with Southend. Okay, but the weather conditions on the continental European coasts are much harsher than they are on the equivalent, East Anglian and Kent coast. Yeah. It's not as far north as you think it is. So the Flushing gap is closed again on the 2nd of October, and they use a whole plethora of items. But the main thing is they use an intermediate pontoon. They plug the main gap, right? And they use 12 Navy Light pontoons, 4 beetles, a 10th barge, and 250 tons of torpedo netting. Now I'll explain why that is on the next diagram. Vestkapelle gap is closed on the same day with 2 intermediate pontoons, 2 beetles, a water barge, and a stone and sandbags. And the Veer gap is closed on the 18th of October and filled in on the 23rd of October. And again, they just get that in on time because they have a huge storm beginning 23rd of October. And that goes into the beginning of November. Now, this is the gap at Flushing. This is the actual way they close it. Now, what you see here is on the top diagram, where those 4 beetles are, Those are some of the beetles that have been swept inland, right? On the but they keep them spared so they can reuse them.
Right.
Now, what you see there's a Thames barge. Now, the Thames barge in that picture is next to the Thames barge. There's actually two beetles that have been used as, they call them doorposts. What they tend to do on the sides of, on the ends of the dikes, when they built the dike to a certain where they built.
It's brilliant stuff. I'm not surprised. Just you get a struggle every now and then. It's incredible.
No, I'm trying to get my hands in position.
Right, there we go.
When they built the two ends to the point where they can't go any further without the erosion stopping them, what they then do is they put a beetle or another ship on the end of each end, or one end. So we're saying, well, we're stopping here. We put a beetle on each end so it can't get eroded, right? That's a doorpost, and we'll drop the ship between those two doorposts. Okay, that's what those beetles are. So you go back to the diagram. Yep. Now they try a Thames barge. Now what they try to do here with the Thames barge was they try to obviously you can see the Thames barge doesn't cover the whole gap, right? So they thought, we'll put a Thames barge in and we'll fill that little gap to the right of the Thames barge with maybe a beetle or so. But of course, what happens is when you put the Thames barge in, that gap's so small that the water is absolutely shooting through that gap. Okay, so putting that Thames barge in ends up being useless. So what they do is to fill that gap. It's saying, we've got to put something in that fills the major portion of the gap in one go. So they put that great big thwacking intermediate pierhead pontoon in, right? And that fills most of the gap, okay? And then where there's little gaps on the side, and they put two beetles in behind it, and that's to stop, because obviously when it goes down on the bottom, there can be little gaps underneath it, right? That water can flow under, and that can erode. If you let it keep going, it will erode under your obstacle. So they put a couple of beetles in behind it to plug those gaps, okay? And then those NL pontoons were put on top of the intermediate in areas where the water was still continuing to flow over it, okay? And then what they did is they built a clay bund, and on the top picture they built a clay bund over it and filled the gaps. And those gaps are either side of the pontoon. That's what they use the torpedo nets for, right? They drop torpedo nets in these smaller gaps, and they cover those torpedo nets with clay, right? So you have to get a plug. What happens is if the water's coming in, the force of the water will push the torpedo nets into a tight spot. Right.
I got you.
So the water works with you in those situations and actually plugs those little gaps. So what you tend to have is the main gap you put in with a big piece of equipment, and you use maybe smaller pontoons or ships to cover the smaller bits. Then any gaps you put torpedo nets in with either clay or stone to actually plug the gap completely. Then you build a clay bund over it. Now, in the bottom diagram, it's partly a cross section of the top, but after the sand has been added behind the clay bund, right? So the top diagram doesn't show the sand being filled in, but the bottom diagram does. It shows the sand behind it, and it shows, again, that big rectangle on the bottom diagram is the intermediate. The smaller white rectangle behind it is one of the beetles behind it, and the two lumps on top of the NL pontoons. Now, when I showed you earlier on an ideal cross section of a sea dike and how it's built up, you can see that's a bit of a bricolage in comparison. Okay, right? That's a sort of like, it looks a bit sort of jerry rigged and all that sort of thing. But what will happen is they will build, although that intermediate is exposed, as when the water's down, they will build the clay over it. Right. And they'll build a sand beach over it, so that whole thing will be totally enclosed. Okay, so you won't know it's there. And that will still be there today. I mean, all those objects in that dike will still be there today. And there's some, as we will see, there's some quite interesting equipment hidden under the dikes of the Walcheren. So just a couple of quotes here this is from Eric Esberg Reed. He says, the final closing of the gap is one of the most impressive sights imaginable. Grabs and tugs and barges are moving for many miles out to sea with the meticulous organisation needed to call in everything exactly as needed. At the closing of Veer, I reckon that there were 70,000 tons of shipping afloat adjacent to the work. Full rehearsals are essential. Okay. And Reginald Perry, who's the chief engineer of Line of Communications, he said, the gaps at Vescapel and Nolla, which is Flushing, through the strain of the heavy pounding to which they were subjected, and it would appear that there is every justification for thinking that the two gaps have been finally and securely closed. Okay. Right. Those are just some pictures here. Now these are taken from actually a printed report, so they're not top quality pictures, right? They're just taken from the report. Now this is at the Vescapel, and the water you can see is inland, right? This is the inland side, okay, not the seaside. Now you'll see what appears to be a crane is actually a floating grab, right? That's a barge with a and that is actually stuck there. Right, that's been brought in and built up around, and that will be what that we're mainly doing is moving clay and stone on and you won't see it, but it's for the outer side of the dike. Okay, and that will be sealed in when they finish the dike, and that will still be there today. Okay, and this is again Vescapel. You can see the lighthouse in the background. Yeah. If you look on the right, there's those two sort of like. Looks like two layers of cake. They're two intermediate pontoons. Because these are the two intermediate pontoons that are going to be towed into position and built over. And again, this is the inland side, so they're being towed in from the inland side. Okay, and this is them in position. You see, so and you can see there's a gap. There's a gap between them where water's still coming through, and that'll probably be sealed with a beetle or with some clay or something. But it's taken. Most of the dike is actually sealed there. Most of the gap is sealed there. And this is a picture from the other side on the other side of the dike. And this is Vescapel as well. And you can see that cord where that red arrow is. It's just pointing to one of those intermediate pontoons is still exposed. Okay. And again, those two intermediate pontoons will be sealed over with clay and then sand and then revetted and right. Now this is Veer. This is at Veer, and the gap at Veer was sealed by two German invasion barges. Okay, so if everybody says, are any barges from Sea Line still in existence? Well, yes, they are. It's just that they're
buried.
They're in a dike at Walcheren. Okay, and you can see that the crane there behind it, what looks like a crane, is that's a floating grab, and you can see that bucket. It's clamshell bucket, and you can see there's some rope wires. It's holding some rope wires, right? And what those are the side stringers for. Because what you do is, generally when you're moving these big ships into position for sinking, you move them forwards and backwards in the water. You move them by tug, right? But when you want to align them from the side, generally they line them from the side using Caterpillar D8 bulldozers on the land. Okay, so when you want to move them sort of like, forwards and backwards, you would use hang on, I'm trying to get this direction right. When you move them in and out towards the sea or towards the land in that direction, you're using tugs. When you're trying to move them sort of like end on left or right, you use on land bulldozers. Right. Okay, and on land bulldozers are massively more efficient than tugs. Okay, a Caterpillar D8 bulldozer can pull a mass as big as like the biggest tug. Okay, so it's much easier using bulldozers if you can. Now this is Veer again, and what you're seeing here is you can see the floating grab on the left there. you're looking end on at the two German barges, so you can only see one of them. Okay, and but they're both there, and they're both there in position. Now, to the right of the German invasion barge, you can see a beetle, right? And you can see all those holes in it, all those square holes in the top of the beetle. Can you see those?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now those aren't part of the design. Those have to be cut in, right? Because obviously a beetle's been designed to float. They sink it. You've got to cut holes in the open, and that's where they're going to pull. They're going to put clay in as they sink it, and that beetle is there to seal the gap between the German barge, and you can see this dike end here, right? That'll go down and it'll slip in and to fill any gap in there. Now behind the beetle, you can see a flat barge with a load of stone on, okay, and that stone will be dropped on the beetle and probably also on those German ships when they've hit the bottom, okay. And in the foreground, you can see that pipe.
Yep.
That pipe is obviously the sand shooting pipe from the blow of the dredger. Okay. So you can see it's all happening at once. Okay. So during November, as November starts, Vescapel, because that's the one that's subject to the most to the most savage weather, they dropped some Phoenix units offshore just to act as breakwaters, and that was tested in the tank at Delft University as well, where exactly to put the breakwaters. And in the tank at Delft, they could actually work out where those breakwaters had to go to the nearest foot, right? So they know exactly where to drop those Phoenixes. And during the same period, there was a new artificial beach created in the front of the new dice section at Flushing. They used the sand shooting equipment again. And then both these gaps are accordingly verified as being safe. So Reginald Perry, who's the chief engineer line of communications, says on 15th November, the main canal Flushing Veer has been breached with bulldozers for 120 feet, and the dewatering of the Northern Islands is going on through this, as well as through the few natural sluices. The drop in the water is phenomenal, averaging 4 centimetres a day, and the island is visibly dry before one's eyes. It is now possible, except for one small gap, which will soon be made good, to motor without a duck from Middelburg to Domburg. And Domburg's on the coast just north of Vescapel. So you can all that area to the west and north of the Flushing to Veer Canal, right, is basically clear. They can get the water down, and one of the funny things is the roads are almost perfect actually, despite the fact they've had terrapins and ducks on them for almost a year now. Well, 9 months or 10 months. Those roads are actually in pretty good condition. So by the end of November, deflooding has been completed on the western side of the Flushing Veer Canal. This allows the British to commence their final withdrawal from Walcheren because the British want to go, right? Although some of the Royal Engineers are left, because all the effort is now concentrated at Fort Ramekins, right? And Fort Ramekins is a tricky job because although it's the least important, it's the one area where the channels are the deepest. For the three gaps, for the three main gaps on the western side of the island, the deepest channel is about 3 or 6 feet, right? At Ramekins, I think some of the channels are about 30 feet deep.
Wow.
Right? And there's also big holes as well, and they're even deeper. Okay. So the first go at it is on 20th November. They drop a German block ship to seal the remaining gap, because they put some intermediate pontoons in, but they drop a German block ship. It's a block ship. It's an invasion barge in to seal the last gap. But one of the intermediate pontoons they put in beforehand has slipped, so there's still a gap there. So on 1st of December, they tried to have a go at dropping a Phoenix to seal the gap. there's two large sinkholes underneath it. One's 80-foot deep, one's 50-foot deep, and there's and the Phoenix is on a knife edge between the two. And what happens is that knife edge collapses, and the Phoenix goes down. And if you look on this picture here, if you look in the right in the middle, about 2/3 of the way down, there's that shredded wheat looking like object, right?
Yeah,
that's the Phoenix. And as you can see, it's one end has gone down as that knife edge is slipped, right? So that's like, and you can see there's still a gap there that they've got to work on. And you can still actually see the two ships there. One with steam coming out they're actually floating grabs. Okay.
Right.
So what they do is they decide to have another go and put another Phoenix in. And what this shows is there's this Phoenix case on, and these are 7 tugs pushing it into position. Okay. So another attempt was made on 24th of January 1946 with the second Phoenix laid alongside the portion of the original Phoenix that was still above the water. This was successful, so it worked. And Walcheren was declared secure on 6th of February 1946. Dewatering of the flooded area around Fort Ramekins lasted another 5 weeks, because on this occasion they couldn't empty the water through the canal, so they had to suck it out using a dredger. They just sucked it out with a suction dredger. All the vegetation on Walcheren Island is dead, and 1/3 of the houses are condemned due to the salt water impregnation of their lime water foundations. But they do start a small harvest on Walcheren, and it's brought in by the autumn of 1946. And actually, the recovery, once they've drained it, the agricultural recovery is fairly rapid. Is that it? I think that's the lot. Yeah.
No, I mean, absolutely amazing stuff. And it came up in the show with Tobias on Monday how the actual the changing of the remaining salt that was in the cleared areas and that they were quite good at getting that repaired, because that's how the whole of a third of the Netherlands was created by pushing back the sea. So that kind of bit was relatively straightforward. But as you were talking about the details of all these various parts of the scheme there, I was thinking about never again will I read a book about the Scheldt battle where it just says, and the dike walls were patched up after war. That's what it often just says. And the rebuilding took place over the summer and winter of 1945. I now have a huge amount of information to add on that. We've got a couple more questions. Most of the ones that came in, you actually answered as you went along, but there are a couple of questions remaining. James asked, were there any accidents to any Royal Engineers or Dutch personnel? Because with all that, moving of concrete and explosives, is there anything in the records about accidents or fatalities?
Almost certainly, but the reports I have don't record them. So right. I'd be amazed if there weren't a lot of people injured.
Okay, thank you.
One of the things is some of the accidents were quite amusing. I mean, one of them, actually, think about what was another thing that was a problem was why they had to actually make sure that the dropping of these whatever they were using to fill a gap, like whether a barge or a pontoon, because of course if you drop it in the wrong place, right, you've got to get if you drop a Phoenix in the wrong place, well, it's stay there, right?
Yeah, it's good. It's there now.
If you drop a Phoenix or an invasion, but I think you'd have trouble getting a barge out. But if you drop a Phoenix down, or so if you drop an intermediate down, okay, you can recover it, but you've lost that neap tide. You've lost that time. So that's why all the accuracy is critical. And what happened in one occasion was they actually marked out. They put a buoy in and marked out where they wanted to drop an intermediate pontoon, and they dragged this thing out. They dragged the intermediate out to drop it. When they got there, this marker buoy had gone because some guys on the landing craft had been using it as target practice for their anti-aircraft guns. You see, so and that caused a bit of a ruction.
Wow. Okay, thanks for that. And then Scott asked about were there any cases of unexploded ordnance found? I mean, all those 220 Lancasters dropping those heavy bombers, were there? They must have found bombs.
I've not seen anything that suggests that at all. Actually, what there was a problem with was German mines, and especially S mines, because S mines used to float.
Right.
So often you'd have S mines floating around, and they could go off. So there was no British bomb that went off
Okay.
during the. Obviously all their bombs worked. I would guess.
Yeah, well, that's a testament to the effectiveness of the British bomb making.
Well, the bomber command are very accurate, so
yeah. And then the last question, I'm going to word it slightly differently. Sheldrake, so General Patterson is asking about, did the Dutch improve upon the wartime work? So, I mean, I think we're kind of probably talking like 10, 20 years later, because obviously, that report you ended with the fact that by 1946, they've said that, or 45, they've said that they've made these repairs. They seem to be in place. They seem to be firm. But were there any kind of issues sort of 10 years, 15 years down the line of things that had to be redone? Obviously, flood defense is always an ongoing process, and that's part of what the Netherlands have to deal with. But have you read anything about any particular issues a few years down the line?
I think they did. Yeah, I think they did sort of what's the word? Finesse what had been done during the war. But what also happened was that actually the Dutch actually adopted some of the techniques that Alan Beckett introduced. The Dutch actually adopted for themselves after the war, and they refined. So what the Royal Engineers did, the Dutch took and improved.
That's really interesting. I'm glad you talked about this, the Dutch involvement, because I had a commenter on one of the shows earlier this week, a Dutch guy from the island, saying the Allies are hated still to this day in Walcheren, and they're hated because of all of the Dutch they killed and the devastation they wrought. And obviously, whenever there are fatalities caused by bombings, there is some sort of level of upset. I mean, I live in Normandy, where I know French families who had people killed by the Allied bombing in 44, but I've never sensed any long-term bitterness towards the Allies here in Normandy. And I think what you've said today is that this restoration, this rehabilitation process, if there had been any kind of lingering resentment against the British or the Allies, this process would have smooth things over dramatically. That okay, we did cause this, but here we are trying to make it better for you. So it was a bridge building in a sense, as well as dike repair.
Yeah, the sense I get, of course, the sense I get is that actually the people in Walcheren and South Beveland were generally quite well disposed towards the British. But of course, I'm reading British reports, aren't I? You see?
Yeah. I mean, these things are complicated. They're nuanced. I mean, so my French friends here, there's an understanding that the Allies brought the liberation. With the liberation came death, came bombs, came fire. But I think it's interesting that the British had this attitude of, as you said earlier, that we made it, so we'll fix it. So, but we will end things there. So, folks, I remind you that some of the information is in this book here, which I'll put links to the Amazon versions down below, and we'll bring you back for something in the future. We were talking about tank recovery and tank transportation as a potential subject, but you're welcome back whenever you want to, sir. And folks, that's me done for the weekend. We've got our panel discussion with Arthur, Mike, and David on Monday about the Canadian Army and the Scheldt campaign in a kind of contextual idea. And then we've got a few shows. John McManus is on next week. John Parshall is on. No, not John Parshall is on next week. And we've got a few more shows coming your way. So thanks everybody for your attendance, for your questions. Thank you, Phil, for a brilliant presentation. I will see you all after the weekend. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.